Hi guys, my name is Amanda, your local Gen Z person talking about Instagram again. Today I'm going to be discussing the Instagram infographic industrial complex. And fun fact, if you add industrial complex to anything, it makes it sound like you know what you're talking about, even though it actually makes no sense. So that's what I'm doing today. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about those aesthetically pleasing, pastel-colored mini PowerPoints that look like a direct-to-consumers brand attempt to sell millennials a fancy toothbrush, bed sheets, or credit, except they're advertising social issues and have been taking over your Instagram feed for the past year. Instagram activism distills complex social issues into bite-sized 1080 by 1080 chunks that usually explain what these issues are and how you, the average person, can help. I do think that for the most part, people who make these graphics and share them on social media are well-intentioned, but intention is different from impact, and I want to talk more about the impact these infographics have. But first, let's trace the history of these infographics. Where did they come from, and how did they get to our feeds? Combining design and activism isn't necessarily new, but the digital medium of social media is. Infographics can be traced back to 1900 when W.E.B. Du Bois and his collaborators at the Atlanta University prepared a series of visualizations, which he called data portraits, sourced from years of sociological research into the economic and social conditions of Black people in the United States. And infographics have been a staple in activism since then because they're efficient and make complex information and issues digestible. I think what differs with infographics now more than ever, though, is that anyone can make them and everyone, no matter how big or small, has a platform to share them on. A massive surge of these infographics started in June 2020, and the death of George Floyd was the inciting incident. After his death, there were tons of infographics explaining how to be anti-racist or detailing various forms of systemic oppression against Black people. But as I said before, what I really want to talk about isn't the specific social issues these infographics advertise, rather the implications of this medium of Instagram activism, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, so I'll start with the good. Off the top of my head, the thing that immediately comes to mind is that people can genuinely learn from these infographics. On Instagram, these graphics offered resources for activists, such as information on how to get involved and where to protest, as well as infographics detailing the historical conditions leading up to the protests. So You Want to Talk About breaks down progressive policies like defunding the police and polling place restrictions, explaining their history and importance. As we know, America really likes to sweep much of its racist history and present under the rug and teaches US history from a very white point of view. When I was in school, I was taught that racism was essentially eradicated after MLK's I Have a Dream speech, and this is obviously far from the truth, but it's why in June 2020, so many non-Black people could learn from Instagram activism, even if it seems surface level and obvious to us. Even I, as a Black person, have used resources recommended in these infographics and taken actions like donating to certain organizations. I hope the sheer volume of these Instagram infographics has at least prodded ignorant people to reckon with their privilege and the oppression of other groups, but obviously infographics can't dismantle systemic issues, and posting them online doesn't mean much if you're not taking action in the real world. This brings me to the bad. The bad. Infographics may give the illusion of making change, but without actively committing to it or addressing their own contributions to the problem, it becomes a case of performative activism or woke washing. As a person of color, and especially as a Black person, performative activism is what immediately came to mind when Instagram infographics started to gain traction, and I certainly wasn't alone. In June 2020, I was actually surprised at how many non-Black people were seemingly outraged by George Floyd's death and supported Black Lives Matter when they previously never even whisper about race. It's sad, but my immediate response wasn't, oh yay, people are finally talking about this. I was suspicious. And I still have to amend this with the fact that my social media feed is like my own personal bubble, and I'm likely to surround my digital space with like-minded people, so that influences what pops up on my feed. But I was still shocked because I'd never personally witnessed so much support for Black Lives Matter in one place at one time. I use quotes because it's the internet, which is kind of everywhere and nowhere. Anyway, it was weird because I felt like a lot of non-Black people were really having this moment of awakening when I felt like I'd experienced that a few years before with the death of Michael Brown in 2014. That was really a turning point for me because I think it was the first point in my life where I was really able to absorb the deadly implications of racism outside of my own experience with microaggressions, and it just really changed my perspective of how I went about life, and it never became an option to not think about race in how I moved through the world. And it's not even to say like, oh, I was woke before all these people. It was kind of just like, wait, everyone didn't have this moment before. Like, you guys are actually just learning that racism still exists. And so that brings me back to the performative activism element of this. It's hard to differentiate if people were genuinely ignorant of this kind of thing or they just chose to ignore it until they quite literally couldn't anymore. And this is kind of a side note, but it kind of makes me wonder how the Black Lives Matter movement would have played out this summer if we weren't in a pandemic and if people weren't forced to like only experience the world through their screens. Like, there was no option but to look away. Like, it was the thing going on because nothing else in the world was like going on. It kind of makes me wonder like if we were able to be like distracted by like living normal life, would it have even gotten so much attention? Anyway, according to Wikipedia, performative activism is a pejorative term referring to activism done to increase one's social capital rather than because of one's devotion to a cause. It is often associated with surface-level activism, referred to as slacktivism. In June 2020, if you weren't posting or reposting infographics that condemned racism, your silence made more of a statement than what you actually said, especially if you were an influencer. And when people start calling you out for not doing something and your goal is to stay in the good graces of the general public or your followers, the easiest thing to do is to appease. To post that infographic to your story or to put BLM resources in your bio for a few weeks so it doesn't look like you're racist or ignorant. And I think a lot of influencers did that, and it kind of became a bandwagon to jump on. I felt like this kind of performative activism was less of a performance and more of a race to check off an imaginary box, which was just incredibly dull and empty. But I also think there's a more sinister performative activist, one that thinks a couple of steps ahead and uses activism as a means to propel their popularity and appeal. They'll post the infographics less because they really believe in these causes and more because posting it can help them gain traction and capitalize on the moment. But really the worst thing about both these approaches to performative activism is that the impact of this Instagram activism is rendered obsolete if you're doing nothing to be actively anti-racist or to support whatever cause you're promoting in real life. You know, the that's enough activism for today type of thing. Some people genuinely believe that reposting an infographic is adequate activism and they don't go any farther than that. Thankfully, most infographics do make clear suggestions of nuanced text to read and organizations to support, but on social media, it's nearly impossible to tell if people ever actually take those suggestions into their real lives. I think this begs the question, is performative activism better than nothing? I say this mostly in the context of influencers though, because their posts are inherently more performative because of their larger audience. I think most influencers really are aware of how performative their Instagram activism may seem, and I totally think this is a valid concern that a lot of influencers have, but I think if you are integrating activism into your real life, you shouldn't have to worry about virtue signaling because your posting is supported by actual actions. You know, it's not like you have to post every little good deed you do on the internet, but I do think if you are a public figure who lets fans into your personal life to an extent, they're going to feel entitled to know your position on these kinds of issues if they're all over social media. And I do think it can be easy for influencers to severely underestimate the impact they can have with their platform. I feel like I've even experienced this a little bit because as you get more followers and likes and views, it somehow feels less real because it's less personal with a larger audience. You're kind of just like feel like you're talking to a void. Like, you know, you start with talking to a void because you have no followers, but then you get some more and you're like, oh hey, there's people here watching it. And then I think it gets to a point where there's like so many that you can't even like recognize individual usernames or whatever, so it kind of feels like you're talking like to avoid again, even though there's more numbers next to it. The point of this isn't to say with influencers it's a lose-lose situation whether you post infographics or whether you stay silent, because it's honestly not. If you really believe in these causes, you should be doing something about them in your real life, because that's what matters more than anything else. And then if you do decide to post activism infographics, you have something to back that up, you know? Like how gold used to back the US dollar. That's a fun analogy. Psychological studies have shown that behavior drives attitude. It's not the other way around. So posting something on your Instagram story and not changing your behavior isn't going to do anything. Changing your behavior, being actively anti-racist, is going to change your attitude, and that'll probably actually influence you to post on your Instagram story because you truly believe in whatever it's saying. Okay, so now for the ugly. When it got to the point where corporations were participating in this weird performative activism that didn't even feel like activism anymore, they were only doing it because it was profitable. And I think that's what really started to suck the soul out of these originally revolutionary and well-meaning sentiments like Black Lives Matter. You have to ask, what does Black Lives Matter really mean if the NBA is painting it on the side of a court? Is it anything more than the other advertisements that surround it? I'm not even a naturally cynical person. I think it's cool that Black Lives Matter is painted everywhere, but I really don't think most of these corporations actually believe it. And I think as soon as they believe it, that's when they'll stop saying it, because their actions can actually speak for themselves. The corporatization of progressive politics reveals itself to be nefarious when it links the anti-capitalist ideology held by activists that have led the Black Lives Matter movement to global prominence to the corporations themselves. The primary purpose of a corporation is to make money, so I don't think it's corporations' responsibility to end racism. But we live in this capitalistic society where the government places the onus on corporations and individuals to be responsible for social issues like racism, and I think that's why we have this really skewed ratio of surface level activism to actual change. So yeah, that is my take on the ugly of corporations co-opting social issues for monetary gain. But for the next part of the ugly, I'm going to discuss the element of aesthetics and design in Instagram activism. I have to say, what stood out to me the most about these infographics wasn't the actual content, the activism, but the design. Like I mentioned before, I'd seen these kinds of aesthetics used to advertise for corporations, but never to advocate for activism. Activist-minded creators have raised concerns about the packaging of modern political messaging. Historically, artists haven't shied away from the political. If anything, some have sought to subvert or degrade corporate aesthetics and design choices in an attempt to disrupt and craft a new visual language for their own movements. On a platform like Instagram, however, playing against the rules might not necessarily be rewarding, even if it does make a stronger statement of one's politics. By borrowing the stylistic elements popular within the capitalist sphere, creators are co-opting them for a greater, arguably more moral cause. The aesthetic is relatively simple: clean, bold-centered font against a plain background that only includes essential information. It follows the age-old adage, less is more. It got to the point where I was seeing like the same 5 really nicely designed and aesthetically pleasing Instagram infographics being shared on people's stories, and it made me think, are these ones getting shared simply because they're the most beautiful? In theory, this definitely makes sense, but after a while, it honestly felt slimy and kind of annoying to see how people were specifically posting these infographics that match their feed, and I think it got to the point where it felt too oversaturated, and people were posting these things because they look good and not because they truly read or even cared about what the infographic said. And it also begs the question, is it even appropriate to make activism aesthetically palatable? If that's the only way that we can digest this information, what does that say about us? And, what does that say about the platform that we're using? As corporations and individuals become attuned to the widespread adoption of memes and certain creative aesthetics in online spaces, they could further be used to commodify tragedy and obfuscate revolutionary messages. I really do think that making these aesthetically pleasing activism Instagram infographics, that was so many words, I really think it started out with good intentions and as a way to spread the message. But I feel like in the medium of social media, where you can kind of do an endless scroll and just see basically endless amounts of information in a day, I think we kind of get numb to the actual impact of them, especially when it gets to a point where the aesthetic actually matters more than the message, because on social media you kind of just have to optimize things to be visible, and if pretty is what is visible, that's what you have to do, and that's what works. So people are caring more about how these things look than what they're actually saying. And that also brings in the element of oversimplifying these issues and the potential to spread misinformation, which, as we've seen on Facebook, is that's really bad. So yeah, honestly, it's kind of hard for me to think of a conclusion to this video. I'm complicit in promoting aesthetic Instagram infographics and such, and trying to use like memes and certain aesthetics to like subvert the activist message, while actually really just thinking more about how I'm presenting it rather than what I'm actually saying. So yeah, while I think this is an interesting discussion to have, I think it's sad that it got to this point in the first place. And I think that it's just important to remember when you're reposting these types of infographics to really ask yourself, what are you doing to actually support whatever this is saying, and is it even necessary to post it if you really can't back it up with any tangible actions that you're taking in real life. I think if you're intentional and thoughtful with your posting of these things and not really mindlessly just putting them out there to check a box, I think that's what matters the most. I also think it's important to remember that systemic racism is systemic for a reason, and that it can't necessarily be solved on the individual level, so you shouldn't have to place that burden of yourself like you feel like you need to solve racism. All of these issues can seem very abstract and impersonal until it's your life, or until it's your family member, or until it's your friend. So I don't know, I think it's just important to be empathetic at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Instagram infographic industrial complex. I'd love to hear yours below, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!